Thanks to everybody for coming this evening to what is a very important and certainly a very timely event. This white paper we know was published yesterday, and it probably begs as many questions as it answers. We probably all agree in this room that mutuals have the power to have a transformative effect on the public sector, as well as changing the way the private sector works as well. But what are the barriers that have prevented mutuals from, in recent years, from the upsurge as some predicted? And what can the government do to remove these barriers and obstacles? And the big question we now need to address is, what will the landscape for mutuals be in 4 or 5 years' time? Will there be a fully formed marketplace? How will mutuals be financed? What will their relationship be with the private sector and with public services? They're all hugely important questions, and we have a very distinguished panel to discuss them over the next hour and 10 minutes or so. We can run until about 7:15. Julian de Grand is one of the foremost thinkers in the field of public service reform. He was a senior advisor to Tony Blair and is chairing the government's mutuals task force. Ali Parsa is the Chief Executive of the Circle Partnership. Circle, an employee-owned partnership with over 2,000 partners in the UK and Europe. And Jesse Norman is an old friend of Policy Exchange and one of the biggest advocates of mutuals and employee ownership in the House of Commons. He's also the chair of the All-Party Group on employee ownership. Just a quick word that Roberta Blackman-Woods, who was due to be on the panel, had to pull out due to parliamentary engagements changing. So she sends her apologies. Julian?
Okay. Well, I think I'll remain here, if that's all right. I won't launch into a paean of praise for mutuals, but since I take it most of us are pretty well sold on the idea. But what I will do is just say a little bit about the Mutuals Task Force, then a little bit about some of the benefits of mutuals, but briefly, and then some of the barriers that we encounter. I may just sort of list them and then leave it open for discussion how we overcome some of those barriers. In terms of the Mutuals Task Force, this is set up by the Cabinet Office. The original terms of reference, I said something about driving through the process of mutuals. I think I prefer the language of encourage the process of mutuals. Partly because I do think that at top, the essence of most mutuals are, in some sense, they are bottom up, whether they are community mutuals or employee-owned enterprises or user enterprises and so on. So the idea is all top-down imposition doesn't make a great deal of sense. Okay. So we have these 3 kinds of mutuals. The Mutual Task Force is going to look at going to encourage the development of mutuals. There are these 3 kinds: user mutuals, which is the sense where the members of the mutual are consumers in some sense, or users. That was the original kind behind many of the financial institutions that became mutuals, member institutions, and of course the co-op, the retailer, is a user mutual. Then there are community mutuals, where mutuals are owned or operated by some form of community group or some form of stakeholder groups around. But some of the ideas of the new for operating post offices in village areas and so on, those kind of mutual. And then there are employee-owned enterprises where the employees are the chief members. And then there are, of course, there are also mixed models where you get some employeeship. Okay? How are we doing now?
Yes.
That doesn't seem to. Shall I stand up and yell? I'll speak to this one. We've got employee-owned mutuals, mixed. We've got some. All right now? Okay. We've got some employee ownership, some community ownership, or some user ownership. We in the Mutuals Task Force are concentrating at the moment on employee-owned enterprises. We have a number of reasons for that, but one of them is limitation of resources. We've got to concentrate on something. But there's also a case, I think, that in some sense, in many areas, not in all, but in many areas, employee-owned enterprises show the most potential for engagement and for moving forward. After all, we do spend a large chunk of our lives at work. So the possibility of getting engagement by the people involved seems to be rather greater than, say, we spend 0.05% of our time actually engaging in retail shopping, so actually becoming the owners of a retailer or whatever, engagement might be rather less. Nonetheless, having said that, there are going to be areas where user mutuals are more appropriate, or consumer mutuals, or community group mutuals. However, employee ownership is what we tend to work on. Benefits of it, well, we see two kinds of benefits. There are intrinsic benefits and instrumental benefits, forgive the academic jargon. Intrinsic benefits, meaning benefits to the employees themselves in terms of improving morale, improving productivity, improving happiness and well-being, and knock-on benefits from that to their delivery of the service. They deliver the service more effectively, more efficiently, more productively, more innovatively, as a result of their greater commitment and engagement with the service. What do we perceive to be the principal barriers towards developing mutuals in the public sector? We have a kind of aspiration, and incidentally we are public sector focused is our intention. We have an aspiration of 1 in 5 people being in mutuals, 1 in 5 workers in the public sector being in mutuals by 2015. This is, I deliberately use the word aspiration. I don't know if we'll make it or not. Some people think it's an absolute nonsense. Others think that it may be feasible. But there are very considerable barriers to trying to take it forward. If I can just name a few, there are both technical and cultural barriers. The technical ones, many of you will be familiar with. There are problems over procurement. Should the mutual, if we spin out a mutual from a public sector organisation, should they have a kind of infancy protection period, a period when they are protected from competition in terms of procurement? If we do set up some kind of protection for them, is that consistent with EU procurement rules and so on? A number of very difficult issues there. On the whole, I think our view is that yes, they should have some protection period. That you really won't get many people spinning out if they think they're going to be competed with by some of the large private sector firms immediately for competition. Although I think most people would agree that there should be a level playing field for competition at perhaps a later stage. Procurement's an issue. Pensions, enormous problem about pensions. VAT, it never occurred to me that VAT would be a problem, but VAT is a significant problem in these transfer issues. Asset lock. Should there be some kind of lock on assets so that they cannot, the mutuals cannot be taken over by private sector companies or one form or another? There are ways of dealing with that. Maybe the public sector can lease the assets to the mutual, or maybe some other form, rather elaborate ownership structure can be set in place. And it is clearly possible to do that. I mean, John Lewis has a very elaborate ownership structure, and very difficult, I think, for any company significant to take over John Lewis. Finance, big problem of trying to, can mutuals obtain the necessary finance? Ben Jump, who's here, has just written a very useful paper on this topic, but it is obviously a major issue. I mean, you might think about some kind of joint venture, but is it possible to have joint ventures with, say, private equity or with some equity shareholding without the shareholders having only 51% of the stock? And Ali, I think, has views on this, and he'll be able to tell us something about that. So there are a range of issues of that kind, but one thing's always technical. There are also more cultural barriers, I think. There's a range of ignorance about what a mutual is and what mutuals might look like. And that's important, and that's, again, we see one of our tasks in the Mutual Task Force to try and do something about that. We thought that many of the major blocks would come, in particular in the public sector, within Whitehall, within departments. I have to say, so far, not a lot. That's not really where the barriers appear to occur. The barriers appear to occur much more at kind of senior or middle management level. You have a group of employees who would be keen to spin out, be keen to set up a mutual. They go along to their manager and the manager says, no. Or says, well, I don't think we've got any appetite for that at the moment. Of course, a lot of local authorities particularly don't have much appetite for it, and understandably, because they feel themselves grappling with what they perceive to be enormous cuts, enormous problems, and this is just another problem at the end of their, when they're at the end of their tether anyway. And in fact, I think that's the biggest aim of the task force, or the biggest challenge the task force faces, is to convince the key people that mutuals are a solution and not a problem. And really our task is to try to persuade people that mutuals can actually resolve some of the difficulties that local authorities, the NHS, various other authorities faced by, they can actually manage to provide, they can use the same resources to provide a better service, or they can use reduced resources to provide similar levels of service. So I think on that note, Chairman, I will stop and turn over to the others.
I used to have an old professor who said, if you stand up to talk, you better have content in what you want to say, or you better tell jokes. Julian had the content, I better start telling jokes, I guess. I want to spend actually my 10 minutes, if you allow me, Chair, not to talk so much about the practicalities, but actually about why. Why mutuals? Why to have employee ownership in our society? Because I think until we win that debate, can I just get rid of this? We don't have this. So until we win that debate, the rest of it is almost secondary. I think it was General Tsai who wrote The Art of War, who said that, and you all know it, his most famous phrase in there was, strategy without tactics is a slow way to success, but tactics without strategy is a sure way to defeat. And that's exactly, I find, that in this debate sometimes is happening. People are saying, why mutuals? Why big society? What is wrong with the society we currently have? And I think until we have a serious conversation about what is wrong with the structure we currently have, it's going to be very difficult to debate why should we change the current structure. So let me spend a little bit of time talking about that, if I can, and then we can go through the details of our conversations in the questions and answers. Here's what we've done. We've had a gigantic financial crash in our society. We all know it happened in 2007, 2008. The question is, why did it happen? We all know that, and the question is, was it incidental or was it a structure? We all know that it happened because some traders traded the credit they did not have, particularly in real estate, but also because the government spent the budget, overspent the budget it didn't have. It was a two-flank thing, right? That's what happened. The question was, why did that happen? And I think there was a structural reason behind that. Think about it. In Britain, we uniquely have a society in the Western world that 90% of all assets, productive assets, belongs either to the state or to financial institutions. Our civic society, the people who do the work in our society, own between them about 10% of all our productive assets. Compare that with Germany, where 35 to 40% of all assets belong to Mittelstand, small, medium-sized companies, who are distributed across the country. Go to a restaurant in Britain, chances are it's owned by a chain that is owned by financial institutions. Go to France, it's owned by a family who's been there for decades and has a waiter who's been there for 30 to 40 years. They have a connection to their society. What's the result of that massive concentration of ownership in UK? In the hands of the Whitehall on one hand, and the city on the other hand. The result is, in Germany, the difference between the richest part of Germany and the poorest part of Germany is 2-fold. In France is 4-fold. In America is 5-fold. In China is 8-fold. In Britain is an unjustifiable 10 times. That is not right. I think we need to have a debate in our society that says, do we come out of the financial crisis that we've had with a clear mandate and ambition to rebalance our society, to cherish the role of the financial services institutions, because I think that big finance plays a very important role in Britain, and for far too often it gets bashed for wrong reasons, but also to cherish the role of the state and the public services. But say both of them need to provide enough room for our civic society, for our small businesses, for our medium-sized businesses, for people who want to set up their own things, for our entrepreneurs. And create a much more balanced society in which perhaps we have 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. If we approach it in that way and win our population on that basic argument, then almost everything else falls into part. If you go out there and say, I want to cut public services and cut the size of the state, people say that's my job. If you go in and say that, look, 53% of the GDP belongs to the state, in parts of Britain, the size of the state is bigger in relation to the GDP than parts of Cuba and China. And actually, during the average time during labor period, it was around 40% of the GDP. I'm going to take that 53%, and I'm going to take it to 40. Then everybody understands why we need to reduce the size. It's an acceptable agenda. And then say, in the process of doing that, I think it's a fantastic opportunity to grow the civic society, the mutual, to give our people the right to become entrepreneurs, to become charity workers, to become individual business owners or mutuals or cooperatives, by giving them the chance to run their own businesses or run their own services back and provide it back. In that context, it makes sense. So I'm not going to use the 10 minutes you gave me, because then I need to start a different subject, which I can do. But I think it's important that we come into this with a broader perspective of where do we want to go as a society. Because if our government, if our Prime Minister come out and articulate what's the big picture in here, then almost everything else falls into place. Our debate around the healthcare reforms becomes a much easier debate because we know where we're going to go. Our debate around the public sector reform becomes a much easier debate because we know where we're going to go. But also our debate around the role of the financial institutions become an easier debate. I think we need now desperately in this country a big idea, a big society agenda to fall behind and to rally there for all the policies we've got. In the absence of that, I think we're missing something. Look, when we created Circle, the very first thing we did, before we even knew what business we were going to be in, we wrote what we called our credo. That was our set of beliefs. In there, we say we are the agents of our patients, not our shareholders or our stakeholders or our employees. And that made life extremely easy. Because every single time we needed to make a decision, we knew whose agent we are and whose decision we need to make in favor. And every time I have a debate with my executive, the answer is very clear. And that clarity matters, because I finish with this. People say, well, I've got 80% of the way there, don't worry about the rest of the 20%. I kept 80% of this reforms or this policy, don't worry about the 20%. My answer to them is the same I always tell my executive when they come to me and say, I've got 80% of them there. I tell them that, look, that a human being shares 83% of its DNA with a cockroach. What differentiates us is the other 17%. Let's make sure we get this right. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Ali and Julian, for that. A couple of quick words. We're almost at 20 years in which I have been involved in employee ownership of one form or another. I was a member of a thing called Job Ownership Limited, which was the antecedent to the Great Employee Ownership Association in the mid-1990s. And I can tell you it was a strange experience for someone of a conservative disposition to be doing that. Especially since I was working in City of London at the time. But it did give you an extraordinary opportunity to compare and contrast these different ways of thinking about forms of human organisation and forms of human institution. And I absolutely pick up on the point that Ali raised just then about the need for a grand linking idea that, as it were, overshadows and arches all of government policy. And as you all know, I tried to write a little bit about that. I think Big Society provides that kind of idea, and I think it does so in a way that directly plays to the issue of what we're calling mutuals, but of course, in government parlance includes co-ops and employee-owned firms as well. And those are distinct things, and one should just, it's not wrong to put them together, but it's important just to recognise their differences. And that idea, the idea of the Big Society, is that linkage, because at its heart is the notion of empowering institutions and empowering individuals, and those institutions being the ones that lie between the state and the individual, of which these organisations, mutuals, co-ops, employee-owned firms, are par excellence examples. And as Julian has said, part of the motivation for being in one of these organisations is precisely that it is so liberating personally to the individuals involved in it. It does give them, and there's lots and lots of evidence of this, it does give them a tremendous sense of energy, of purpose. We know that what gives human beings their motivation, their drive in life, over and above money, is really three things: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy, a feeling that you are in control of your own life. Mastery, a feeling that you really understand something and have, as it were, something to contribute to it. And purpose, the idea that what you are doing has in and of itself a redeeming social value that goes beyond itself. And I think these organizations give you a perfect example of that autonomy, mastery, and purpose when they are flourishing. So let me just say a couple of things about that. It's very striking in this country that we have such a relatively small mutual co-op and employee-owned sector compared to many European countries and many American countries. We forget in America there's a huge cooperative tradition in America, and the same is true in European countries. And it is extraordinary that a country like this one, which invented the idea through Robert Owen and then of course the Rothschild pioneers, should be so far behind many of these international competitors. And it is so, I think, because we have fallen in love, and we need to fall out of love with a certain kind of corporate model of organisation. And the limited liability model, and that has certain economic advantages of its own, but it is only one way in which you can organise yourself. And of course mutuals and employee-owned and co-ops are very different kinds of institution and have very different benefits and very different merits compared with the corporate model. Now, some of the dangers of what you would call the over-corporatization have been touched on by Ali. One of the things that we've seen has been this extreme growth in the disparity between the least well-off and the best well-off in terms of the compensation structures within corporate UK. Another effect has been seen in the financial sector. Now, when if you had looked at the British financial sector at the end of the 1980s, you would have seen a very diverse coral reef of different kinds of organisations, in which, broadly speaking, you had partnerships which took risk but didn't have any capital, and you had large commercial banks which had capital but didn't take risk, and then you had large numbers of other different kinds of organisations lying between them. That has all gone. That's been homogenized out of existence. We now have a single, essentially, corporate form in which most financial institutions are based, and an awful lot of diversity and the benefits that existed in that earlier wide coral reef have been lost. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the mutual sector in the building societies. Now look at the building societies have never been absolutely immune from failure, of course, because they tend to have naturally constrained models when it comes to capital, and capital has been at a premium in many ways over the last 20 to 30 years. But it's nevertheless true that their record stands up extremely well in the face of the last financial crisis. And one could be talking about Nationwide, we could be talking about the Co-operative Bank, both of which had a completely different kind of ethos to the slash and burn, devil take the hindmost ethos that was being bred at RBS by Fred Goodwin, or at HBOS by Messrs. Stevenson and Hornby and et al. The fascinating thing is that if you open a modern management textbook now, what you would see is that many of the things that characterize the prescription as to how the best run companies are involved are actually very characteristic of mutuals. It's as though they're trying to ape the benefits of mutuals. So flat hierarchies, so flat organizational structures which are not full of hierarchy, teamwork, an emphasis on human capital. That is what a mutual is. That's how they work. So it's rather ironic that just at the time when corporatization has been taking over large numbers of these diverse, historically diverse organizations in this country, we should be rediscovering their merits in theory in modern management technique. Now, mutuals are not a panacea. It's perfectly clear. It's clear we have to be clear about their strengths and weaknesses, but they do offer a really important set of additional tools in the armory. And I'm thrilled that Policy Exchange is picking up on this and starting to set the agenda in this area, as in so many other ones, for government policy. In particular, it's important to recognise that the mutuals will never be a solution to how you deliver public services. Okay, the sector is just too small. What they can be, however, is a fascinating ethos, a way of thinking about the better delivery of public services, and a set of options presented to people who are thinking about those within government at both ends, at the top and at the bottom. Julian's mentioned some of the issues that exist at the moment. We've had issues of what do we call asset locks. How do you protect public value when you're creating a public sector or a public service mutual? Another idea that I've suggested is that you might, rather than worry about the asset lock, you might have what you would call a golden share, a degree of protection guaranteed by the government owning one share of the mutual, just to give it a freedom from being taken over for that period of time, that golden share having essentially veto rights on takeover, during that process by which a mutual starts to stand on its feet and become established. And as the chair of the employee ownership all-party group, we have published a report in the last month or so. If you haven't seen it, I think it's a good piece of work. And what it does is to draw attention to how it would be a failure of government policy if an enormous number of new mutuals were created, only to be hoovered up by the private sector because they were too thinly capitalised or under-supported. We know these are institutions are culturally embedded, they have a trajectory, they have a tradition, they need to be protected and given that support, ultimately exposed to the full winds of competition, of course, that's the nature of the beast, but they need to be regarded as growing entities and given that support. Another idea that could be experimented with, I hope Policy Exchange will be thinking about in its own deliberations, is the idea of using warrants, as they have done in some building schools of the future contracts, which give the state some of the upside if these things are successful. And if you do that, then of course the attraction of that is that you can be slightly less worried about the actual value of the transfer of assets into the mutual or of the franchise that's been conferred on it, because you know that the public interest is protected through the warrant structure. We've talked mainly about public sector and public service mutuals. It's very important not to forget that there's a parallel agenda in the private sector, and if you really want a flourishing mutuals market to develop, you need to have private sector mutuals, and there are established patterns by which that can take place. And there are many companies in this country which are owned by families which like that long-term ethos, like that employee focus, like the customer focus and the service focus that you get from a mutual. So I think there's a flourishing alternative future in the private sector as well as in the public sector. Government's approach, which hasn't really been touched on in too much detail here, I'll just say two things quickly about that. The first is, I think it's a very interesting contrast in political style. That Francis Maude has not said, we are going to have an idea and then we're going to ramp it up like some political commissar. What he has said is, actually, we don't have all the answers. This is early territory. We need a process of educating government in all its different aspects as to the value of these entities. And so we're going to try and learn a bit. And if that means failing a bit, then that's part of learning. I think that's very important. And the second thing is that I think that the other part of that model actually in a way also relates to kind of what I call good corporate practice, good business practice, which is don't roll out a product unless you've really thought it through and got it working. You can take a period of time when it may not be working to your satisfaction, provided when it does go, it really takes off. And what I'm hoping is that the next year or two or three will be one of real learning and real effort made to roll out some of these different models, to make them work, to start spending that lubricating money we've been hearing so much about in the public service white paper and before, on getting this market set up. And then, if it's done well, and if it's done with real care and forethought, I've no doubt that this opportunity will take flight like a bird. Thank you very much indeed.
I think that was fascinating from all three speakers. There's a great deal to discuss over the next 35 minutes or so. If I could just take advantage of my position as chair by asking the first question. The white paper that was published yesterday, Jesse spoke about the mutuals market, which is in development. How much do you think the white paper forces a gear change towards the development of that market? Should we start with Julian?
Well, I think the white paper emerged at a time when we were almost guaranteed to get virtually no attention whatsoever. I was rather struck by actually the lack of attention that was paid, although hardly surprising. And I think actually, I have to say, I don't think it contained a great deal that is new. An awful lot of it are policies that have been put in place by the government. Some of it building, dare I say it, on some of the policies that originated in the Blair government, which in turn was building on some of the Thatcher and Major reforms. So there is a kind of continuity. I argue quite strongly that what we're seeing really is evolution rather than revolution in these developments. But nonetheless, but no less important than that. And the key is, and I testified for a select committee recently in the House of Commons, and somebody, I think it was Labour MP, asked me whether I thought he asked more generally whether I thought the big society in 6 years' time would go the way of the third way of 6 years ago. My response was, I don't know about the big society, I suspect, I don't think we will go that way, but I certainly think the mutuals agenda will be with us in 6 years' time, and I hope much bigger than it presently is.
Now, tough to believe, but some of us don't read white papers, so we got companies to run. So unfortunately, I have no idea what the white papers are. Or I do have some colleagues who very diligently read through it and understand it significantly better than I do. But I do want to make one point around this. It's almost the policy is secondary in this. The question is the will and plurality in our society. And I think the one mistake the white paper can make, and I've noticed there is a couple of references to it, is to try and say that this is the only way it's going to work. I think there are some great private sector companies, actually in this room that I know of, that are doing a fantastic job. And I think that locking people away from business just because of their model of ownership is almost as much of a mistake as locking the mutuals or the third sector or the social enterprises out. What we need is a very wide, very pluralistic approach so that this nation can bring to its problems all its talents in all its forms to try and solve that. And who knows which one of them are going to do better.
Thank you very much. Because as Julian says, to misquote the unlamented Joe Moore, it's a bad week to bury good news. So I think that's what's happened to the white paper, sadly. The good news, however, is that this is now in the political bloodstream in an important way, and I think that is rather an achievement. It's particularly important because there is an embedded bias within certain parts of British government against the various kinds of organisations we're talking about, and I particularly mean the Treasury. The Treasury doesn't have any sympathy particularly with mutuals, employee-owned firms or co-ops, and it is in the grip, as I've argued separately, of a kind of rigor mortis view of economics, in which we are basically economic automata and nothing else. and until it's shaken itself into a slightly richer and more thoughtful notion, it's going to be hard sailing. But this is an important step forward in that process. The other thing, just to pick on what Ali said, is I wouldn't underestimate the degree of zeal within government on this. I mean, I think it goes all the way up to the Prime Minister, and Francis Moore is really very evangelical on this topic. And I think if you've got, it's quite interesting. There is a little bit of a contrast to last government, because if you remember, there's a Monk Commission launched, and then basically, which was thinking about broadly similar set of issues, and wrote a report which then instantly died. And actually, I'm rather hoping that, and I rather think the fate of this line of thought will be rather different.
There are some 3 seats at the front if anybody standing at the back wants to sit down. Start with questions, Magnus at the back.
Magnus Scoon from Stereo. I'll speak loudly if everyone can hear me. I think I was particularly struck by the comments about one of the major barriers being the permafrost of middle and senior management, sometimes not letting some of the ideas bubble up and the enthusiasm bubble up. To what extent is it important to intentionally bring through a cohort of public sector entrepreneurs and really encourage entrepreneurship in a sector which entrepreneurship is sometimes avoided or sometimes not acknowledged?
Well, yes, I think very important. Partly because public entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs like Ali and others can break that particular model, can break that barrier. The problem is that there are not many of them, or not enough of them, probably to get the broad sweep that we would like. Although I think they are essential as pioneers to show that these things can be done and that they don't lead to disaster, and indeed that they actually lead to better public services, in some cases to the real transformation that I agree with what Jesse was saying, and Francis Moore is very committed to as a way forward. I think the problem with middle managers and senior managers is, well, what's in it for them? And that is an issue which I think we have to address. I was talking to the Permanent Secretary of DCLG the other day, and he was saying, well, your problem really is commissioners. Why would commissioners be interested in doing this? Many of them, for middle managers, and possibly senior managers too, it means losing their jobs. Or if it doesn't mean losing their jobs, it means their job is going to change from being a manager to being a contractor. And that ain't an easy shift to do. So I think it's a challenge for us in the task force, but everybody that's committed to this, to think, well, is there some way we can convince that group that there is something in it for them, that they will enjoy the new role that they might have, and that ain't going to be easy.
2 things on this. One is, look, building a company, as you all know, is as much of an art as is it a technique. It's we go to school to learn how to paint, and we assume we just build a company. And building a company requires, in my view, especially from a startup, it requires 3 ingredients. And you miss any of these 3, you think you miss having a great company. It needs entrepreneurial drive, as you quite rightly said. It needs entrepreneurs. It needs employee passion. It needs people who absolutely love doing what Jesse referred to in terms of purpose and the rest. But it also needs financial resource. And if you can't bring those 3 elements together, and there is more, but if you can't bring those 3 elements together, you have a lot missing in this. So I think the idea that we can go out there and say, you can become a company, missing any of those 3 elements is going to be tough. And particularly, I think, in earlier stages, if you don't have the entrepreneur. So if I look at very successful employee-owned businesses, for instance, that Jesse referred to in his, by the way, I second that is an excellent all-parliamentary group report that Jesse and his team wrote. And if you look at the companies they refer to, at the heart of each of them sits a great entrepreneur that have been putting those businesses, or entrepreneurs who've been putting those businesses together. But they also need to, but they're struggling with finance, and financial resource is there, by the way. I think the city has a substantial number of great investors who actually get it as much as anybody else do. I mean, we're blessed with having some fantastic investors that it's a privilege to be our investors, and I like them as much as I like my board of partners that I do. So that part I think is really important. But you're absolutely right that entrepreneurs are there and should be there. Can I just go back to the point Jesse made and also you referred to, which is about then what else is there to stop it? Because I think that's fantastically important. We have in Britain an absolute culture of not taking the risk, and the Treasury symbolizes that culture. So this idea that only big is good, show me what's the size of your balance sheet before I can give you some work, it's nonsense. And we need to kind of overtake that. Because unless we do that, because that idea was propagated by the idea that nobody ever gets fired buying IBM. The truth of the matter is everybody who bought IBMs in the 80s got fired. And they only got fired after they lost a lot of money for their organizations. They should have bought a PC. And what we need to think about now is how do we challenge that culture outlook? That is deep in our society, and that's one. And the second part is, and I can come to that later, but it's the provision of capital. We also need to think, where is our startup or growth capital in Britain? Because there is no G word growth without the F word finance. Pure simple, right? And we don't have a period of simple credit, easy credit in Britain meant that all our private equity firms became leveraged buyout firms. And one of the most fantastic cons in renaming an industry. We don't have private equity in Britain. We have leveraged buyout in Britain. And they're about taking an existing business's cash flow and borrowing the money, and then you get the nonsense that we're seeing in I won't name a company, but you all know.
Right, thank you very much. It's perfectly true there aren't enough, in fact, many, if any, public sector entrepreneurs yet, and we need to grow a new generation of them. There are two things to say about that. One is that you can't do that if you have the idea of an entrepreneur as a kind of Richard Branson figure. In other words, it's a different mindset, and it's really about a kind of alertness to opportunity rather than a zeal to enrich oneself. The second thing is that mindset is 1,000 miles away from the mindset of the classic public servant in local government or with a service delivery arm. And that's as it should be. That's not what we've been asking those people to do. But it does mean that there's going to be a rather challenging process of transformation and enabling to let that happen. One of the things that will make a difference, I think, is publicising the rather larger than you would think number of social entrepreneurs that have sprung up in the last 5 years, and indeed even in private sector mutuals and co-ops, because the rule of entrepreneurship, as you may know, less so in this country but in the US, is when they've done one, they want to do another one and do another after that. And in Britain, generally speaking, people make money and then go and try and retire as quick as they possibly can. But that isn't, I think, really what's at stake here. And the joy of doing one social enterprise is that it fires you up with the zeal to do more.
If we start taking 2 or 3 questions in one go, the gentleman at the front and Andrew at the back both had their hands up before, and the gentleman at the back there in the grey tie.
My name is Omar, and I'm a lawyer for the Government Legal Services, and I hope my question demonstrates zeal, drive, and passion, as Andy was talking about. When Professor Legrand talked about not driving through a process of mutual, I want to share with you a live example of how culture can stop something coming into being. One way to bypass the whole agenda of mutuals and right to request is to set up a social enterprise. So a couple of us asked the question in our department, what do we do if we want to set up a mutual? We had a unique value proposition. We went through everything. We bought a website, we bought a domain name, we bought a logo, and so forth. We in fact had a meeting in the Cabinet Office. And then what happened after we had written to a certain Secretary of State, we found that our letter did not go beyond the private office to the Secretary of State, to whom actually we presented, who loved the idea And we didn't require a huge amount of finance. Just the idea itself was enough to trigger off, as it were, a political nuclear situation whereby you can't take this further. In fact, our meeting with the Cabinet Office was cancelled because certain people were not happy. Having taken advice, went and spoke to a DG, a Director General, what is wrong with this idea? The person could not explain why there was any problem with it. There could be a perception. So I don't think you can take the back foot and say we're going to encourage it. People are going to risk taking and making proposals and so forth, and then I don't think the Cabinet Office or others who are pushing for this can let those people down. You've really got to drive this through, because there are interested parties who, for whatever reason, will not allow this agenda to progress. Thank you very much.
There was two at the back there as well. We try and keep the questions fairly short because we're fairly short on time.
Thanks very much. Andrew Laird from Mutual Ventures. We're actually a social enterprise who support groups of public sector workers who are taking up the mutualisation opportunity. Question is really, if you look 3 to 5 years in the future, some of these mutuals are going to fail, and that failure represents at the very least a service disruption for quite a lot of users. So with the backdrop of the Southern Cross and that type of thing, what should our tolerance levels of failure be? And it'd be really interesting to hear from the politician, the academic and the business leader to see if they're any different.
Andrew Marshall, Fishburn Hedges and Camden Council. I understand the non-financial motivation that mutuality brings, but if we accept growing income inequality as one of the big challenges, what is the evidence around the world for mutuals being able to stem, to have a dent in that tide, either in terms of income or possibly in terms of job security, which may be as important?
Okay. It is a very important story you've told, actually, and indeed it's ongoing, as you and I know. But it is a classic example, and it points out too that, of course, there isn't just a cultural barrier within departments or within local authorities, but you might actually have potential competitors in some senses whose self-interest is directly threatened by this. And again, this is a very important barrier that's necessary to get across, but perhaps we would have a little word about this afterwards. Andrew's point about, I think there are 2 points. There's the general point about thinking about mutuals in 3 to 5 years, which we're tending not to do. We are thinking about the business of trying to get them up and running now. But of course, 3 to 5 years is very important, and particularly it's important if they fail, because if they fail, they may discredit the whole idea, and we may see the whole thing going away in the third way. So what do we do about failure? Well, it's always been a problem. Of course, failure is a problem for any public service, however it's organised. The normal strategy, actually, what we do with failure is, well, there are 2 strategies. One is we ignore it and we just continue pumping money into the hospital, the school, or whatever, endlessly. Just keeps on going. The other, of course, is to, the strategy was often a merger strategy. You take an efficient hospital, an inefficient hospital, and you merge it with an efficient hospital and pray. And actually the result is almost invariably, there's quite a lot of research evidence on this, 2 inefficient hospitals. So it's a problem. Maybe the solution lies something like the warrant idea that Jesse was talking about, or some sort of insurance idea by which actually there is some kind of the organisation concerned pay an insurance against failure, and then that into a fund, and that reserve is used to buy to keep the service going, but under different management or whatever subsequently. But it's certainly an issue that has to be addressed. I'm sorry, and the other point was about financial sector. Sorry?
Impact on income inequality.
Impact on income inequality. I suppose the general belief is that mutuals in both the public sector and the private sector will tend to be much more egalitarian in terms of internal structures than corporations. And that was one of Ali's points, that very much that's likely to happen. If you look at the wider picture, mutuals, there are, believe it or not, disadvantages to mutuals. And one of them is that some of the research evidence suggests that, particularly in the private sector, they're not necessarily very good at generating employment. In a sense, you can see why. I mean, it means that workers are taking on they take on other people who are going to then demand some of the surplus that they generate. They're also, incidentally, while we're on that, they're also tend not to be very good for highly capital intensive or areas where you need the adoption of new technology fast. Again, you can sort of understand that actually workers will tend to view new technology often as threatening in one form or another, and so are reluctant to take it on. You need capitalist firms, conventional capitalist firms, are much more nimble in those contexts. So I think, more generally, I suspect that probably mutuals won't listen to a great deal about overall inequality. Probably others might want to comment on that.
Letting people down, you're absolutely right. I mean, we can't do that. And that's why I thought the most important thing in here is it's creating a sense of mission. I voted open for David Cameron, having voted for Tony Blair. I'm not party political, right? And I voted for David Cameron because his idea of the big society touched me. And I thought it's exactly right. And I was proud to vote for the idea of the big society that creates a balance. We need to create a sense of purpose for people who stand up. So when you go against your bosses and they say no, you're proud to say, actually, I'm delivering a significant mission of this government. And I'm doing the right thing for this country because I'm rebalancing the economy. And I think for that, you're absolutely right. People need to stand, and Jesse's right. There are people like Francis who have a phenomenal, and Jesse and others, and Nick Hurd and many others, and the Prime Minister, who have a phenomenal belief in this. I just think that this now needs to become the ideology of the government. In the same way that it was, the ideology of Margaret Thatcher was absolutely clear. It was about getting Britain working again. That's what it was, everybody got understood it. And we need to be about rebalancing the thing. Once that is in place, once a framework in place, a strategy is in place, then you have the permission to go and do what you want to do. And not only you have the permission, you're proud of it too. Now, in terms of why if mutuals fail, so what? Businesses fail all the time, right? I mean, it goes back to what I was saying. We need to accept that you have to take risks in our society. Right? The question is not if the mutuals fail, the question is who will take on the service. And if we have a model that allows others to take on the service very quickly instead of them, then that's fantastic. Look, when we liberalize, and it goes back to the last point, which is financial impact, but also the length of term, because you said about 3 to 5 years. I had the privilege today to have lunch with the Vice Chancellor of my old university, UCL. And I'm struck every time I talk to Professor Brown that he's always thinking about what's the effect of what we're going to do, Ali, in 50 years from now on UCL. It's never about what is it 5 years from now, 3 years from now. In 50 years, will UCL be a great institution because of what we're doing? Think about the liberalization of the telecommunication industry. It never was, can Vodafone and can others provide a service 2 years from now to everybody? British Telecom was. It took over 25 to 30 years to do what it's done. And the other day I moved house because I'm doing some renovation in my house. And British Telecom, in a great, good old-fashioned way, completely, utterly failed to connect my phone. Did I care? I had my mobile phone in my pocket. I was pirating my neighbor's Wi-Fi. Everything worked perfectly well because there was a whole series of other providers out there from whom I could choose. If you want to mutualize, if you want to give services to others, they also have to have plurality. So people have that choice. And nowhere that is more important than public services.
Thank you very much. Yes, well, in terms of the case study you mentioned, I just say one thing, which is I think at the very beginning of understanding some of the implicit tensions that comes when you really start to open up options for delivery of public services. Best of luck. And best of luck to the government, because it's going to be quite hairy in some respects, I think, managing this.
That brings me neatly on to failure tolerance. Andrew's question. Of course, there are three things that will help to guard against failure. One is a really strong, organic, mutual ethos. The second is a well-functioning structure that may be a trust-type structure, as in JLP, but maybe variety of different options. And the third is capital. Adequate capital to make sure that these things don't fall over immediately. As in any small business or large business, it's the absence of cash that is the trouble. I think that, as Julian says, there are intrinsic limitations to the mutual structure, one of which is often availability of capital. So that is the one that I pick up on. In terms of failure tolerance, I think the government's got to have a degree of failure tolerance, because you don't learn without the willingness to accept failure. Of course, that's easy to say when you're a very small junior form of pond life in the great political pool. So, my view may radically change if that changes, but I think it's unlikely. What I would say is that if you get failure, when you get failure, as the City of London has told us, you need a failure regime. You have to have a mechanism that has to be built in. That's another form. It's another reason why this relatively cautious, let 1,000 flowers bloom, let's learn something approach that Francis Moore is taking is, I think, very well worthwhile. On Andrew's question on evidence on income and job security, there's every reason to think that widespread mutuals would increase, because of the reasons that Julian's described, income equality. Now, the mutual sector is relatively small compared to the whole, so it's not going to make much of a dent in the aggregate numbers, but it would help. It's quite noticeable if you read Richard Wilkinson's book, Kendrick's book, The Spirit Level, which is wonderful on diagnosis and staggeringly weak on policy recommendations. That one of the few things they do say is that mutuals and co-ops are part of their solution. I think that's really a reflection of their personal politics rather than a practical suggestion for problems of economic inequality around the globe, but there it is. One of the advantages of mutual structure is that you do have you avoid some of the weaknesses in the corporate model. As you know, one of the problems with corporations is that they give rise to what economists call agency problems, in which, roughly speaking, the managers decide to ignore the shareholders and enrich themselves. That's much harder. I mean, there are other weaknesses to mutuals, but that's much harder in a mutual structure because the management is you, or if it isn't you, it's someone you know very well, or someone you can get to very quickly. And even if you talk at a firm like John Lewis, it's very clear that the chief executive or the chairman feels under quite a lot of pressure every day to look his partners in the face and be able to justify his own performance. And that's one of the reasons why the multiplier, the earnings multiplier, is so much smaller there than it is in the private sector. So there's an ethos there which I think could come into the rest of the private sector rather slowly, needless to say, because it'll be fighting its way all the way through in order to, and if that started to take hold, that would in turn yield greater income equality. So, but each of those is a long-term matter. There are no instant solutions, I think, for this one.
If we take 3 more questions, the gentleman at the back, in between the 2 previous questions. The question has had his hand up before. Lady in red at the front here, and the gentleman at the back with the grey shirt, and I'll take one more from the gentleman with the yellow tie.
Thanks very much. Campbell McDonald, Lex Partnership. The white paper doesn't have a legislative timetable. Is it missing the equivalent of compulsive competitive tendering measure for mutuals? If it is, what is that measure?
Hi there, Matthew Booth. I work in local government. I am interested in the business case behind mutuals, kind of building on a point that I think was made by a colleague from Camden about before all of the ideology that is about productivity and employee engagement and so on. For us in local government, clearly becomes, what's the financial case for doing this? Much of the criteria that we would go through to assess the financial viability and efficacy of going down a mutual route apply to many other routes of taking a saving that others would feel are less risky than going down a mutual route. So specifically, what would be the financial and business case behind mutualising from your experience and knowledge?
Thank you. Tom Levitt, former Labour MP and now writer and consultant on charity matters, and one who finds this agenda fascinating and exciting. A question about capital. People have raised it several times, that capital is required for any new enterprise to get up and running. And this year, the year of the big public service cuts, is the time when opportunities for mutualisation perhaps going to be at their greatest. How do you mutualise a service which doesn't exist perhaps in 2 years' time? Yet the Social Enterprise Coalition, amongst others, has said that it would take 3 to 5 years for the investment community, who after all can't buy equity in social enterprises or mutuals, to get up to speed with the change in the mindset that's required to invest in these businesses. So how do we get those two timescales to work together? And if I could just add one final one, Ali, I'd really love to know what's happening in Hinchinbrook, because as I understand it, sorry?
So would I would love to know.
It's all sorted out. Oh, lovely. But,
so would I. Not sorted out. So would I.
So would I.
I'll leave it there and hope we get a more full answer in a minute.
Liz Banks from the social investment business, and we in fact provide capital and business support to spin-outs. Something I should talk to Tom afterwards. But my question is about not the supply side of mutuals, but the demand side for them. So, build on the question earlier, how at a time when commissioners in local government and in the health service are facing backroom cuts themselves, so their actual own resources in their offices are diminished, never mind the budgets they have to play with, what can be done by the task force and by government to encourage them to take the risks that it is a risk, to engage with new providers, and not to, as you would expect people to do in a time when budgets are tight, time is difficult because they've got fewer staff, they will just hunker down and go with the relationships with the big providers that they already know. Why would they take a risk on an unknown organisation, mutual they don't know yet?
Okay. Campbell's question, he's heard a lot from me in recent months. Legislation. At the moment I'm against it, the idea of legislation, partly because I think we have to move slowly. That's partly because actually we don't want to, and it relates to some of the other questions that you raised actually, we don't want to set up very rapidly a lot of mutuals that are then going to fail. Because then the idea will be permanent, well, discredited for our lifetimes anyway. So I think we need to move slowly. We will, and legislation will immediately thrust it even more into the political arena. We'll get some massive opposition will have to be overcome. Already we are, of course, getting a lot of union opposition. It's quite interesting, actually, I think, to think about the sources of that opposition. There are two strands of left-wing thinking. One is a kind of which relate to the mutuals issue. One is a Marxist that basically views capital and labour as fundamental as two competing blocks, fundamentally hostile to one another. And the other is the kind of Owenite, which Jesse mentioned earlier, which is a much more co-operative tradition that comes through. And they are antithetical in many ways, because the capital-labour opposition thesis, a mutual is labour taking over some elements of capital, and then moving to the other side, and that isn't really acceptable within the kind of the framework of that. So, and I think some of the union opposition, I think, comes from that particular strand of thinking. But for the moment, I'd rather move slowly. And I'm not moved down the legislative route. I'm open to persuasion on that, and I'll be interested to see that comes about. The financial and business case, I think, again, it's a longer term. I'm going to slightly withdraw something I said earlier, which is I was saying, and I thought I don't wish to say this, which was that, what I said earlier was that, and it relates to your point too, that it's, mutualisation is a good way for local authorities to cope with cuts. I actually don't think it is. I think many of the mutuals will take a long time to get established, a long time to get up and running properly, by which time we should be out of the recession. People do don't forget this, recessions come and go. There will be a boom, about 2 or 3 years' time, I would predict nicer time with the election. But these mutuals, most of these mutuals, I don't think we will get going effectively until 2 or 3 years' time. So they are not an easy answer to the problems of cuts right now. I'll dodge the financial question, partly because there are 2 people in the audience here, Ben and, sorry, didn't catch your name, Liz, who are expert on the finance issue. It might be quite interesting if Chair, we could maybe get a comment or 2 from them about, in response to your question about finance. And finally, your question, your final point, which I forgot.
How do we engage with people at government at the back and commissioners when they are facing tough times?
When they're facing cuts. Well, that's the question, yes, that is right. I mean, I do think that that's that actually mutuals are not the answer to cuts. And the danger is that if we have them as the answer to cuts, and we try, or let's say some employees facing, some public sector employees facing unemployment or facing being made redundant or whatever, and they set up a mutual, the trouble is that the reason why they're facing unemployment is because their income stream is being cut off. And if we set up a mutual, there's no guarantee that income stream is suddenly going to be restored. So they're going to be in trouble, almost from the word go. Unless they can find other income streams. And again, I don't think that would be good for the image of mutuals.
Liz, do you want to just, I've just got one out of the top here, do you want to quickly respond to the point made about finance?
About the availability of it? Yeah, I mean, obviously there is not as much money out there as there are people who want the money. And so people like us, there are social investment businesses, only one of many social investors out there. But we have to therefore impose criteria and restrictions to try and pick the best projects that we can find that we think have the best chance of success. So we think we're investing in projects that will be successful, but even those ones we find the people setting them up, it's not just the capital, it's the business support. They need help understanding income streams, understanding cash flows, getting all that kind of paperwork done because, as has already been said in part of the debate, they haven't been necessarily entrepreneurs before, so they need not just money, although that is scarce and there should be more, but they need support. They really need some support to get these mutuals to a place where they're going to be financially robust and sustainable.
I'm just trying to think which one should I pick up, not to take too much time. Let me just pick up this issue of taking the risk. What was the point you made about taking the risk on the new people, right? Because I think it's really important. We are where we are because the old people have failed. It's just not no misunderstanding about this, right? The old system is not doing right. We used to spend £40 billion a year in healthcare when you came to power. We now spend, by you I mean Labour came to power. We now spend £120 billion in healthcare. What was that? A period of 13 years? We tripled, if you define economically value as quality over price, we tripled the denominator of the equation. Can I see the hands of those who believe that we tripled the quality of healthcare? Clinical outcome patient experience went up by 3 times in the last 10 years. Who thinks that? Right. Because it went up, but if it didn't go up by 3 times, we lost significant amount of economic value. The existing system is not working. And that's why we are in the financial crisis that we are partially where the state is. So you need to do this purposefully. So I finish with what I started from. There needs to be a purpose and a mission that is actually creating an alternative system where those who deliver the services have an ability to mandate those services is right. And now, for those who say, well, the system failed because the people who are in it are bad, rubbish. It's got nothing to do with that. The New York Underground in the 70s was a disaster land. In the 90s was a great place. By the way, same people did the same work. IBM was a disaster when it came to the late 70s, early 80s. But the people who were in IBM came out to create this whole generation of new companies that did that. And why did IBM, I mean, just think about technology, because I think there's a great parallel in this, and it goes back to the risk-taking issue, right? What happened? Throughout its 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, one single company, IBM, was responsible for 90% of profitability globally of technology. Nobody would buy anything else but IBM. It will be a disaster, they said, right? And what happened to technology? It got more complex and more expensive by the day, right? 1975, PC got invented. By early 1980s, Microsoft, who by the way were people who came out of the IBM, did what, or Oracle, did what IBM could never do. Yahoo did what Microsoft could never do. After that, Google did what Yahoo could never do. Yahoo wouldn't even buy Google for $1 million. Can you imagine if now Yahoo had to choose whether Google can come into business or not? Give it permission? And then Google, and then Facebook, and then Twitter, and so on and so forth. Right? Innovation comes when you bring barrier to entry down. And it's a job of commissioners. If there was one single job the government can do to promote this thing, is to bring the barrier down. Don't promote one against the other. Don't give advantages to one against the other. Just bring the barrier down and let the next 20 years play out. And I do say the next 20 years. If I was government and I'm not, so what do I know about this? But I would have thought there's one single task I've got if I want to get re-elected. And that is that as I disrupt the society, those who are getting disrupted are never going to vote for me. They probably never did to start with. Can I create in the next 3 to 4 years more beneficiaries of my changes than outweighs those who lose? Can I create more people that benefit from the big society, not necessarily immediately, but in the longer term, who have aspirations to do so? So by the time that it comes election time, they say, actually, I can be the next beneficiary of that. So I've taken an example on this. And let me then finish with your question on Hinchinbrook. I have no idea what's happening with Hinchinbrook. I tell you, my golly, what a phenomenal success story will be for this government and the previous Labour administration, because it is started. If Hinchinbrook does progress, and it does demonstrate what employee ownership can do to one of our most troubled hospitals. Because it does what we absolutely know it can. And look at it, it's fascinating to me. It's got complete global support from local doctors who've written to the Prime Minister, to the trade unions, to the MPs in the Labour side as well as in the. If that can go ahead and demonstrate what it can do, I absolutely believe Hinchinbrook will be the first of many of our hospitals. And then the same will happen if your service goes and demonstrates what it can do. So the job of the government between now and the next 4 or 5 years is not necessarily to give everything to mutual or new model, but give enough that come the next time, more than enough people that are disrupted can see the benefits of what can happen if the new things happen and they can become beneficiaries.
Right, well, we've got -1 minute, so let me be quite quick. At the moment, the evidence is that Hinchinbrook Hospital is killing patients. If it could be taken over and reformed, that might do more to advertise and to make publicly acceptable the benefits of this very organisation than almost anything else. On the legislative timetable, I'm afraid I agree with Julian on this. This is absolutely not something to be hurried. Maybe in 3 or 4 years' time there will be a case for that. Hopefully things will be going well enough that it wouldn't be anything like as politically contentious at that point if it happened. As Julian pointed out, unions are radically split on this. That's very interesting actually. I mean, when we were looking at the mutualisation of the post office on the all-party committee, you know, the sub-postmasters were really rather welcoming and thoughtful about this. The communication workers were absolutely unreconcilable, indeed incapable of even contemplating the possibility that they couldn't respond to the question, if this becomes a mutual, how would you react? Because they couldn't allow the possibility to exist that it might become a mutual. Extraordinary. In terms of financial and business case, it's a very good question. Obviously, I'll talk about specifics. It's really going to be about a balanced judgment about existing services and the extension of existing services and the possibility for growing that enterprise in a way that benefits the council and the other stakeholders. I think secondarily, for the reason Julian's described, it really shouldn't be about savings. And this will come on, we'll talk about this in a second, slightly more. That's not a good reason to set up a mutual, though it's often quite a popular reason. And the third is that I think a great deal of discipline is required not just to take an easy capital sum from a private sector firm to buy out the same services. but as it were, stick with the programme. And that's quite hard when you're safeguarding public money. On the crunch, I don't actually agree about the timetable. If you think the point of mutuals really isn't just to manage decline and saving and make savings, then actually the 3-year timetable to start really seeing these things take off is quite a good one. On the demand side, in terms of large providers, we've got the same problem across the whole of the public sector. What does Woody Allen say? The lion shall lay down with the lamb, but the lamb won't get much sleep. That's one way of putting the problem. Thanks very much.
I'm afraid we're out of time. Thanks very much to everybody for coming. Thanks very much to the panel. It's been a really interesting debate. If we can thank them in the usual way.